more than just making video games, I like to play video games. Really, there's not much better for me than flopping down on the couch and running around in a dungeon. Well, when that stops being fun is when I get lost in that dungeon. And if you've played many video games, you're probably familiar with this frustration. Well, I can tell you, oftentimes, this can be fixed with visual design. When you look at this screenshot, you can pretty much tell where you need to go. There is an illuminated corridor, and then there are dark areas of shadow. Well, obviously, you're going to go towards the light. Here, there's a cool, icy cave, but there are warm torches. Okay, no brainer. I'm going to go towards the warm torches. If I use tricks like this, the player is not going to get lost. Well, what are these? These are just the basic 2D principles of design. In this case, specifically contrast. And you can use them to solve a huge array of visual problems. In fact, I'm willing to bet that you already fell victim to contrast. Well, that's putting it a little too hard. Here, if you look at the Control Paint store, it is a very low contrast gray site. But then I have these very colorful icons for the videos. Well, that's not by accident, that's by design. I'm using the idea of color and contrast to pull the attention. This is going to attract your eye. When you immediately look at the page, that's where you're going to go to first. So it's not to say it's manipulative, but this is 2D design at work. If you've been looking at Control Paint for long, hopefully you've seen the Principles of Design series. In this series, I talked about the basic principles that help guide two-dimensional composition. Essentially how to take the audience and to move them through your composition through using a variety of rules of thumb. Well, you might notice that scale and proportion are on that list. Well, this is where it gets really exciting. It turns out the principles of design, which you learned for 2D composition, they all apply to character design. They all apply to environment and prop design. Essentially, there's one language and it works everywhere. So if you haven't watched the free videos on Control Paint about the principles of design, you should watch them now. I'm serious. I'm going to pause this, go watch them, and come on back. Okay, now that you've watched those videos, the goal of this whole exercise is the same. It's to achieve unity. The same way that we balance the different principles of design within a composition are going to be balanced within a character design. So you're just blending these various principles in a pleasing way. So the first one we're going to talk about is emphasis. Because I'll use different words like your character should read well. Your character should be clear or obvious. Well, these are all just different ways of saying you should have strong emphasis. This gives you clarity. And cartoons are the best example of this. This is emphasis in its purest form. Sonic the Hedgehog, simple. You can make him really small and he still reads clearly. That's because they've gotten rid of most of the details and kept a few simplified, emphasized forms. Same deal with Hercules here. Look at the size of his biceps. They are bigger than his head. Obviously, this is not particularly realistic, but it shows you that he's a strong guy. In fact, that's his big thing. He's so strong, he can do all these supernatural feats. So they have emphasized the important parts. But instead of movies, let's look for a second at video games. Emphasis is incredibly important when it comes to interactivity. Because if you're running around in a 3D game world and there's good guys and bad guys, you got to be able to know immediately if somebody's going to be dangerous or if they're your friend. And one of my favorite examples of this is World of Warcraft. In its infancy, it was having a little trouble guiding players through the woods. There were a bunch of missions where these players were set off into the woods to find things like mushrooms or treasure chests. But the problem was they were blending in with the rest of the environment. There was sort of an equal visual treatment given to both the trees and the grass, as well as the mushrooms and the treasure chests. So what this led to was sort of confusing gameplay. The players were going off into the woods and getting lost. Now, this was not a problem of style. World of Warcraft is a beautiful game. It does a really great job being consistent. It was a problem of emphasis. So the game designers got together and decided to put a little shimmering glow on the objects that the players were supposed to be collecting. Well, it made a huge difference. All of a sudden, the players are able to go out into the woods, easily find what they were looking for, and go on with their adventure. So the game actually played differently only because of this tiny little change. Just a little change in the emphasis. So you can think of emphasis as sort of an information hierarchy. If you were designing characters for a video game, and you knew that the player was only going to see them for a brief moment, what if they only saw your character for 3 seconds? Would all the necessary info be really obvious? Could you tell if it was a good guy or a bad guy? What about if it was supposed to be a healer or a damage doer? This information has to be immediately apparent. If the answer is no, well then you need to emphasize the important parts even more and diminish or maybe even remove the less important parts. Sometimes the most important decision that a designer makes is what to remove. Another really useful technique is to use rhythm and repetition. So let's take a look at these characters. They obviously go together, but what is it about them that really says we are part of a set? Well, I've gone out of my way to use design repetition. I've used certain elements on each of the different characters in order to make them sort of fit together as a team. And this is a real-world phenomenon. If you were to look at people in the military, they don't all have the exact same uniform, but they have similar enough uniforms that you know they're all sort of on the same team. And this is due to repetition. They use the same emblems, maybe the same camouflage patterns. And it all adds up to sort of a unity. They work as a group. I'm also considering repetition when it comes to the use of color. If you have red on your character somewhere, it's a good idea to repeat that red somewhere else. It's just a good rule of thumb for using color in general. So here I have a few different colors and then repeated them across each character. Once again, this repetition really helps pull them together. And then the way you repeat, well, that's where the rhythm comes into play. Because these 3 characters do not look exactly the same. They have similar components, but they are mixed together in different proportional relationships. So what you get is this rhythm. The 3 characters feel unique, but once again, they're all part of the same set. Now, my favorite technique really goes hand in hand with the idea of unity, and that is balance. Because if you're to really just think of these not as 2D characters, but as 2D designs, you'd want to have all things in balance. So for instance, if you have an area of lots of little details, maybe the face or a weapon, then you would want to surround that with areas of less detail. In this way, you are giving the eye somewhere to focus on and then somewhere for it to rest. If you were to have lots of dark colors in one area, you would want to balance them with little bits of light colors. And even with colors themselves, if you have some very vibrant, saturated colors, you'd want to surround them with less saturated colors. So every point has to have its counterpoint. And it's in this balance that you end up with a pleasing character. Before you go on to the next video, I'd encourage you to look at some of your favorite characters. Whether they are cartoon characters or realistic characters, look for the way that the principles of design have been balanced. Because as you learn more and more about this hidden language, you will start to see it everywhere around you.